At the end of the last lecture, we heard a story called The Old Maid about my great aunt. In this lecture, we're going to look at that story and some others in more depth to see how storytelling works. Storytelling isn't about delivering a fixed thing. It's a dynamic process of you shaping the story with the audience. One way of looking at this process of story crafting and storytelling is through the storytelling triangle. In this lecture, we'll set up that triangle. In the next couple of lectures, we'll look at some aspects of this triangle in more depth, developing your relationship with the stories you tell, and developing your relationship with your audience. Telling a story is a three-way relationship among you and the story and the audience. We can represent this through the image of a triangle, with each of these points of teller and story and audience all connected. Now, the first idea to consider is that none of these points lies independent of the other. They're all connected. Stories are always mediated through a storyteller and exist in relation to an audience. And this is a good place to start because it lets us know a few things right off the bat. First, storytelling is about connections. Stories they exist by virtue of this connection with the audience and that connection with the teller. If a story doesn't grab you, chances are it isn't a good story for you to choose to tell, because in order to tell a story well, you have to be connected to it. So even if there's a good story that other people like, ask yourself, is it a story that means something to me? It's the same question you have to ask for the audience. Your story should be a story that your audience will connect with. You may have stories that are only appropriate for some audiences, but not for others. If a story isn't right for an audience, that won't make any kind of connection with them, and again, the storytelling falls flat. Second, storytelling is about choices. There's not one right way to tell a story, or a right way and a wrong way to tell a story, because a story isn't an ideal form, in Plato's sense of ideal forms. There's not an ideal that you're trying to achieve. Storytelling is a series of choices that you make in how to connect the audience with a story. Now, in most cases, there's a real need to get the story right and to tell the truth. I certainly want to tell the truth about my great Aunt May, but there are many different ways that you can choose to tell that story and connect with the audience and connect that audience to the truth. There are some choices in storytelling that may be more appropriate for one given audience than another. Third, storytelling is an adaptive cultural phenomenon. Because of these connections between the story and the audience and the teller, stories develop and adapt based on the needs and desires of the audience and the teller. Many of the stories that we consider canonized as great tales, from Greek and Roman myths to fairy tales to the jokes that you tell that get a laugh every time. That's the way that personal stories get canonized. You've got these jokes and stories in your arsenal that you know 9 times out of 10 will land with the people you talk with. These stories exist because they connect with tellers and with audiences, or at least with a powerful contingent of audiences and tellers. If a teller has a story, but an audience isn't willing to accept that version of the story either adapts to meet the needs of the audience or the desires of what the teller wants to tell, or that story dies out. So you may have a joke that you love, but if the joke doesn't land with your audience, you'll either adapt that joke and change it, or you'll move on completely and not tell it anymore. Stories survive by virtue of their relationship with tellers and audiences. And in this sense, the very idea of what constitutes a story is culturally specific. For example, Western stories from the US and Europe, they typically focus on character development and a linear plot line. And cultural audiences in these locations, they tend to expect that the story will follow the events as they happened. But in Bali and in Java, there is no such expectation. Your story may center on one event and then jump back in time and then move forward a few years later. And so in these cultures and for these audiences, following a linear timeline is not a requirement for a real story. Now, you may have picked up on something already. These connections between the 3 points of the storytelling triangle, they represent not only connections, but lines of communication. And it's not just a one-way mode of communication. And this is another important point to consider. Think about it. You're in a meeting, and you're explaining to new employees about the values of your company, and you begin to share a story with them about your company. Sometimes we think of this as having the story like you would have a brief or a document, and then you're handing that document over to the audience. Now, we could represent this as a linear diagram, with the story first, that then comes to the teller, who then takes that story to the audience, and we could draw arrows on this linear model, where the story goes to the teller, who goes to the audience. Now, this is useful to see how stories are mediated by tellers. Every story you know, whether it's an orally told story or one that's brought to you in print form, every story you know was brought to you by a storyteller. Even the books you read, the magazine articles, the news items, these stories are mediated by authors and editors and reporters. And the storyteller, the mediator, often has a stake in how the story gets told. The stories you grew up with were probably stories you heard because they were stories your parents wanted you to hear. The stories you tell to your children are the ones you mediate to them. And you probably craft those stories with careful lessons in mind. My story about my Aunt May is mediated by my experiences with her and by my own experiences about how women should act. Now, my telling about Aunt May is very different from the stories that my grandmother told about her, because my grandmother had a very different relationship with Aunt May, who is the subject of the story. My grandmother took care of Aunt May, which was no small task, and May did not behave like my grandmother thought a proper lady should. She walked around in her bra. And Nana was so embarrassed because Nana came from a more socially affluent family. She was embarrassed by Aunt May, and because of my grandmother's experiences, she mediated the stories about Aunt May differently. She rarely ever sang the praises of Aunt May's behavior. And this reveals something big about the dynamics of storytelling in any situation, because unlike the experience of reading a story in a book, where the author or teller has shaped that story and then, after passing through that mediating gateway of the publishing house, then the story comes to you, the reader, and you read the words that are fixed in print. In storytelling, you're sitting there in an audience or standing in front of your friend who's telling you a story, and you might laugh at part of the story that he tells you, which prompts that storyteller to embellish a little bit more. And then you both check your watches and you realize that your break is over and your friend has to quickly wrap that story up. Now, that dynamic encounter of the live performance influences the story. So there's a relationship between the audience directly back to the story itself, and a relationship with the teller as well. We learn something else about storytelling from these directional arrows. Storytelling is a living thing. Storytelling is a process, an action, a thing you do. If this is the storytelling triangle, then the telling exists in the center of these three lines of movement. The story is a living thing. It exists in the moment, telling to a particular audience. And what this means for you, the storyteller, is that while you're telling, you should be aware of these constantly active lines of communication between you and your audience, and the story and your audience, and you and the story. Because storytelling is a living thing, that means that just like any other living creature, it has the capacity for change. The story may surprise you while you're in the middle of telling it. There may be things that you didn't see before in the story that suddenly become apparent to you because, while you're telling it, your audience makes that realization, and you see them realizing it, and I was telling the story of Jacob in the biblical Old Testament to a group of adults. And when I came to the part where Jacob, he has 2 wives who are sisters. And he loves the younger one, but he was tricked into marrying the older sister. And when the wife he loves can't bear children, she says, well, here, take my maid and have children with her. And so as I was preparing to tell that story, I was so caught up in that woman's perspective of being desperate. And then of her maid, Zilpah, of Zilpah's reaction to, what's going on? What do you mean you're giving me to him? that when I was telling that story and I came back to Jacob, I had this moment when I was telling the story when Jacob looks at this situation that's being offered to him. And when I was telling that story, I paused and the audience started to laugh. And at first I was shocked. And then I realized there's this whole other moment and perspective where Jacob just got another woman to sleep with. And so I changed the story right there and said, so she said, well, here, sleep with my maid. And Jacob said, well, okay. And he nods comically. And it brought out the humor of it that I hadn't seen before. But of course it's there. There's some nice potential for a joke about the male sex drive there. And that became a running theme then later in the story, because later in that same story, he's offered another maid. And then, of course, he says, well, okay, nodding. Because I was paying attention to what the audience was responding to, and because I gave myself permission to adapt in the moment, I was able to add in some nice humor and repetition while playing up the modern-day absurdity of the situation. Now let's look at another example of this time from another storyteller named Bill Lepp. Bill is a professional storyteller, and he mostly tells comedic stories. And this storytelling clip is a live recording. All of the storytelling clips you'll see in this lecture series are live, in order that you would see this living relationship between the teller and the audience. Now, sometimes you'll see video or audio quality sacrificed to view this teller-audience dynamic, but these examples are useful because you are going to be telling stories live in front of an audience. From these live recordings, you'll see many techniques that only come out in this storytelling triangle dynamic. So here's just a portion of a story that Bill Lepp tells about buffalo tipping. It's the introduction to his story. Watch how he takes advantage of the audience's reaction to build more humor into the story.
Now, you probably heard of cow tipping, in some sort of sociology class or something, but I'm willing to bet that you've never heard of buffalo tipping. The reason you've never heard of buffalo tipping is the same reason that you've never heard of elk tipping, or moose tipping, or elephant tipping, or alligator rolling. It's kind of superfluous. Everybody knows this means alligator rolling, right? That there's Florida Sign Language. That's FSL. And the reason you've never heard of those things is because you ain't never been to Florida. The reason you've never heard of those things is because they are dumb ideas. Wait, stay with me. Therefore, you know that some man has tried them. It's the way of our people. Some man has tried them, and he has died a horrible death. And his wife told everyone that he ran away with the younger woman. Because it was less embarrassing. That's why you've never heard of elk tipping or alligator rolling. But these guys decided they were going to do a little buffalo tipping. So they snuck up to that buffalo. They put their hands on the side of it and they gave that buffalo a big old shove. Well, buffaloes are bigger than cows. So that buffalo didn't tip over. Instead, he woke up.
I love that story, and I love how he tells it, because he's paying attention to how his audience gets into the humor of things that are foreign to them. It's a change to the story based on his audience, and it gets the audience connecting with the story all the more. For example, as we talked about in the last lecture, you can see the additive qualities of oral storytelling. He adds on examples, and gator rolling, and elk punting, and the story rolls along with this series of and then this, and then this. And half of the humor of his timing is his facial gestures and his quick comedic timing during pauses even, and his arm movements to point out towards the tipping of various animals. And what he's doing isn't stand-up. In stand-up comedy, humor is the goal. In storytelling, humor is the vehicle for the story. Bill Lepp's introduction leads into a story that encompasses themes of friendship and childhood adventure and larger-than-life drama. And later he rounds the story out to a conclusion. So it's not stand-up, but it's wildly hilarious because he threads humor through a narrative about an event. And that narrative thread holds the audience from one moment to the next. It carries the audience along. So let's review some things that we've learned about the storytelling triangle. We know that storytelling connects a storyteller and an audience with the story. And in this process of connecting your audience with your story, there are choices you'll make that are specific to that audience and that story. And this sounds very self-explanatory. Now, we do this all the time on an unconscious level, but there's a lot going on here with these choices. Because storytelling adapts, it morphs. The story changes over time to suit the audiences you come across. So while we may want to think about the story as a set thing, I deliver the story to you whole and intact, I deliver it to the audience. No, our stories are constantly in flux, adapting from situation to situation. And what this triangle image gives us is a visual sense of the living, ongoing nature of storytelling. Because at its best, storytelling is a dynamic dialogue, one in which the teller is listening to what the audience needs, and the audience is listening to the story and the teller, and the story is moving back and forth between them. Now, to illustrate this sense of dynamism in storytelling, let's look at an example of a story being told to an audience again. Now, we've heard a few personal stories already. Let's hear a different kind of story, a folk tale. And as you watch and listen to this story, you can start to see this triangle image come to life. There's a story, and it's animated and mediated through a teller, me, and it's told to an audience. And the audience is constantly giving feedback through laughter or participation, and that impacts the storyteller. So I shift how I'm telling the story. So as you listen, think about how these different points of the storytelling triangle are set in motion. I grew up in northeastern Tennessee, and in our part of the country, there's a lot of Scottish cultural heritage. We're in the mountains. We actually have a farm back home, and we have a working farm. But my family actually married into a clan of Buchanans. And in doing some research about those Buchanans, I found several stories about a man named George Buchanan. And there are actually two George Buchanans in Scotland. There's George Buchanan. He's the historical figure. He lived in the 16th century. He was a tutor to the king. And he was a very smart man. He was an historian, and he, in his spare time, translated the entire book of Psalms into Latin verse. He was a very smart man. This story has nothing really to do with him. This story is about George Buchanan, the folk hero. And the folk hero, George Buchanan, unlike that historical figure, the folk hero isn't limited by time or place. The folk hero of George Buchanan, he hops around in time. You hear stories about George Buchanan placed in a lot of different time settings. And as in the story, from the 9th and the 10th centuries, not connected with that historical figure. But in all of the stories about George Buchanan, he was always a very wise man, but he often played the fool in public. And this story from the 9th and the 10th centuries is no exception. In this story about George Buchanan, he lived on the western coast of Scotland. And he lived in a wee crofting village. Can y'all say that with me? Crofting. Crofting. Yeah, crofting is fishing. That was very good. Crofting is a fishing village. And if you go to some of these towns in the western coast of Scotland, you'll see some of these crofting houses still preserved there. Some of the later versions of them. And the walls on these houses, they are 2 feet thick. And those walls are built that thick so that they can withstand that salt spray and the winds coming up off the coast. Well, George Buchanan, he was a fisherman. And he lived in a wee crofting house, and every morning he would take down his herring net, his fishing net. Now I'm going to ask you to participate with me. Pretend like you're taking down your own herring net from the wall. So reach your hands up and just kind of take that herring net. Very good. Reach it down. He would take that herring net and he would take it out on his skiff and he would cast it out on the ocean. Everybody cast your net out. Cast your net out. Don't hit your neighbor, but cast your net out. And he would bring in all of the fish. And he would bring those fish back. Well, he did that every morning. As with this morning, he woke up, took his herring net, take that herring net down, he'd take it out on his skiff, he cast that net and bring in all of the fish. And on this particular day, he brought the fish back in. You can drop your net. And he brought those fish in, and he was going out after his morning fishing. He was going out to help his father, who was working in the fields. And so he took that herring net, and he hung that wet net up over the fireplace. And he always did this so that the net, it would dry out, so that the net wouldn't rot. He always kept his things nice. So he hung that herring net up over the fireplace, and he went out of that crofting house. He was going out to the fields where his father was, and he walked down the lane, and there's a road that passed through that farm. And as he walked through and crossed that road, he stood in the middle and he saw something. Off in the distance, it was shimmering. And he stood there in the road until that thing, it came closer, and as it came closer, he saw that it was a knight on horseback. George, he had never seen a knight before. And being a clever man, he wanted to make a good impression, but he's George Buchanan. He often played the fool in public. And so as that knight came riding closer and closer, George, he just stood there in the middle of the road, staring straight up in the sky, and he was taking up that middle of the road. That night he came riding closer and closer. And George stood there, just kind of picking at his teeth and picking at his nose. And that night he came riding closer and closer. Finally, he was almost right on top of George, and he reared back on his horse and he said, "Hey, you got to get out of my way, I'm coming through." Well, George, he looked up at him. He said, "Me? I'll no get out of your way. This is my family's land. It's my part of the road. You get out of my way." Well, the knight wasn't used to being talked to like this. You get out of my way or I'll run you down." You couldn't run me down." "What do you mean? I could so run you down." You couldn't run me down." "What, me up here on this big horse and you down there, you piddly little thing?" But then it would be your horse running me down and not you, wouldn't it?" You saw he was dealing with a clever man. "You're a pretty clever man." I am." "What's your name?" "George Buchanan, sir." "George, have you got any family?" I've got a sister. She's back home weeping over the fun she had last year." Weeping over the fun she had last year. And I couldn't figure it out. What do you mean she's back home weeping over the fun she had last year? Well, you see, she's back home having a wee baby. She's weeping over the fun she had last year. I see, George, I see. "Have you got any other family?" I've got my father. He's out in the fields making bad worse." Making bad worse. "Well, what do you mean your father's out making bad worse?" Well, you see, he cut down a wee bit of hay a few days ago. Now, will you look up into the sky and tell me what you see?" And sure enough, that night, have any of you ever been to Scotland? If you, one person in the back, okay, you know, if you go to Scotland and you wait in one place for 5 minutes, the weather will change. And sure enough, what had been a beautiful, cloudless day, it had started to cloud over, and that knight looked up and he started to see those little drops of rain coming down, and they plunk, plunk, they started to drop onto his armor, and he said, "'Tis a soft day, it's raining. And my father's out in the fields trying to dry off the hay. He's making bad worse." I see. And the knight saw he was dealing with a clever man. He said, "George, how would you like to be my man?" George liked the sound of that because as much as he liked being a fisherman, he liked the idea of being a knight's man. He said, I would. "George, I'm going down into town. I'm getting out of this rain. You have given me some riddles. You solve 3 of my riddles, and you can be my man. Now you come down into town tomorrow morning. You come looking and no looking." That's looking and not looking. "You come into town riding and no riding." That's riding and not riding. And you come down into town, clothes and nae clothes. That's clothes and no clothes. You come down, you do those three things, you can be my man. And with that night, he tootled off around George, who was still standing there in the middle of the road with that rain coming down. And the night he went on, and George, he stood there, he tried to make sense of those riddles, and he saw his father coming up out of the field, sopping wet, taking his hat off, wringing it out, saying every curse word you could imagine. Well, they went back to that wee crofting house. They sat down, they made themselves a fire, and sat down, and they started to eat something, and George, he stared off into that fire, and he tried to make sense of those riddles. He looked into that fire, and then he happened to look above that fireplace. And what do you think he saw? That heading net that he had hung up to dry. And he had his idea. Good night, Father. Tomorrow I'm off to be a knight's man. And with that, he went over to his bed, he went to sleep, and he woke up bright and early the next morning. And he went over to that fireplace and looked up at that net. He took off his nightshirt and he took down that heading net, and he started to wrap one leg with that heading net. And he wrapped the other leg, and he wrapped, and he pulled it all up to his waist. And he had invented fishnet stockings. And he kept on wrapping, and he slung that excess over his shoulder. Goodbye, Father, I'm off to be a knight's man. And he went out the door, and he went down the lane. And as he was passing out of his father's property, he passed by the goat shed. And he picked up his father's best goat by the scruff of the neck, and he kept on walking. And he walked until he got closer into town, where he could start to see those houses that were on the outskirts of town. And as he saw those houses, he took that goat, and he took one leg, and he slung one leg over that goat, and he left the other leg on the ground. And he gave that goat a good lick. And he started walking, a-lollop, 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 down the road. And he kept on going, and the people in those houses tried to make sense of what they saw as they woke up and saw this man half on a goat and half on, wearing nothing, and I mean nothing but a heading net. And they saw him as he walked by, and that George, he got closer up to that alehouse where the knight was staying, and he saw that knight starting to come out of that alehouse. And as he did, he kept on going on that goat, but he started to turn sideways. A-lollop, 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 down the road. And that knight, he tried to make sense of what he saw. He saw a man half on and half off a goat. He was riding, and he was no riding. He was turned profile, so he was looking, but he was no looking. And he was wearing nothing, and I mean nothing, but a heading net. He was clays, and he was nae clays. George, you've solved my riddles. George looked up at him. I'm a pretty clever man. George, I want you to be my man, but there's something you should know first. And with that night, he took off that helmet. And all the people saw that this was no knight. This was the king in disguise. Because at that time, in the 9th and the 10th centuries in Scotland, the kings of old, they would ride around the countryside and just kind of check in on the nobles to make sure they were taking care of the common folk like they should. And that's what this king had been doing when he came across George standing in the middle of the road. He said, George, will you be a king's man? George looked up at him, straightened up, tried to look as dignified as it's possible to look, wearing nothing but a herring net. He said, aye, sir, under one condition. Well, what's that, George? Does the job come with a better outfit? And that is how George Buchanan became the king's fool. Thank you. On the outside, you see a storyteller telling a story. But with an awareness of the storytelling triangle, you get more insight into that process that storytellers use in the moment of telling a story. I'm not delivering an intact story to an audience. I've prepared and I've learned the story. And then in the moment of the telling, the story changes. It has to. There's a group of folks out there who are going to connect with some parts of the story and not others. So I've got to pay attention to what that audience needs from the story and try to adapt in the moment to those needs. Now, I love that story, but you might be surprised to find out why I love that story. I have a lot of personal connections to that story, and that's what we'll talk about in the next lecture, how to personally connect with all kinds of stories. We'll take a closer look at the George Buchanan story and the moose tipping story over the next couple of lectures. And as you'll see, this personal connection to your story is essential to good storytelling.